Hey everyone, welcome to week 4, social awareness and empathy. As I sent out an announcement earlier this week, I forgot to hit record during class, so I'm going to just go ahead and do my best to re-record what it was I delivered during class. So this is that attempt. Now, as a note, we did not finish this PowerPoint actually in class earlier this week, so we'll finish it at our next class next week. But hopefully, for those who couldn't attend, you can at least hopefully watch this and get caught up before we do the second half of the PowerPoint in week 5. But right now, this is to basically recap where we were for week 4, which was to look at social awareness and empathy. And we started the class by looking at Paul Ekman's theory of the 6 core basic emotions in humans. And I actually had the class guess these emotions before I presented them on the screen, and they were able to guess many of them. But Ekman's theory identifies 6 core basic emotions that are universally recognized across cultures. And those 6 emotions are happiness, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, and disgust. Just making sure. Yes, I'm recording. I thought I started this and wasn't recording. That would have been funny. I am recording. So anyways, these emotions are considered basic because they are innate. They are universally recognized across different cultures, even in isolated communities. And behind this theory is a whole theory of evolution and how these emotions were basically survival skills over time. We won't go into that. But what's cool about his theory is that each of these emotions, if you think about it, are actually related to distinct facial expressions. So Ekman's research actually involved analyzing facial expressions, and though that research led to tools such as FACS, FACS, which means Facial Action Coding System. And that's really cool because I actually have a lot of colleagues who use that in linguistics research. So now there are modifications to Ekman's 6 core emotions. There's expansion packs, you could say, if you're a gamer, where they identify maybe 8 emotions, or they also take these 6 core emotions and break it down into sub-emotions. But why I bring him up is because his framework is still the foundation to most of the modern emotional intelligence tools that we use today. And so I just brought it up to, one, give you more knowledge. Now you know another theory, right? The theory of 6 core emotions, but also to kind of use that to lead into the emotional check-in. And our emotional check-in supports for this week, as most of our emotional check-ins will for the remainder of class, really support those first 2 components and domains of emotional intelligence, which were self-awareness and self-management, what we did those first 2 weeks, or specifically week 2 and week 3. So right here before you is a quick 3-step model adapted from emotional regulation practices in mindfulness-based emotional intelligence training. And this is simply called Name, Normalize, and Navigate. So I'll walk you through this very quickly. The first thing I want you to do, if you're watching this online, is just pause, take a breath, and silently to yourself identify your current emotional state. And I brought up Ekman's core emotions just as a starting point. So perhaps some of you are still struggling to name the specific emotion you're feeling. So in which case you have Ekman's core emotions that you can use as a starting point. So answer the question, what am I feeling right now in general? Because we know we can have multiple emotional states concurrently. What are you feeling right now? What is the most precedent emotion you are experiencing? So now I want you to think to yourself silently. Obviously, maybe if you're by yourself, you're talking to yourself out loud, or you're naturally thinking silently. Maybe you want to write this down and this is part of your journaling, but think about why you're feeling that way. So I feel happiness because I had a good morning. I feel angry because I haven't gotten enough sleep. Maybe you want to phrase it as, it makes sense that I feel blank. Makes sense that I feel this way because of this. So why are you feeling this way? And try not to judge yourself or think, well, that's a petty reason to feel this emotion. Don't be critical of yourself, but what is it that is making you feel this way. Now, this step in itself reinforces that emotional validation and self-compassion, which were foundational components of self-management that we covered last week. Finally, I want you to think about a self-management strategy that aligns with that emotional state. What can you do to help stay engaged today? So if I'm anxious, I'm going to remind myself that I've gotten through worse. If I'm frustrated, so a little positive self-talk, right? Or that re-narrating the issue, right? If I'm frustrated, I'm going to try to take a deep breath before I respond. If I'm tired, I'm going to take good notes during class so that I can stay focused. So in this step, we're thinking about what's one helpful thing that you can do next, given the emotional state you're in and what has brought you there. Now, if we were in class, I invited people to share. We'll have some really good responses to this one. But why this method works? Well, first, it connects that emotion identification that we learned in self-awareness to the behavioral regulation that we learned in self-management. And so this kind of encourages that strategic thinking about how to stay on track, even when your emotions are intense. So remember last week when we talked about self-management, part of some of the key skills of self-management were staying motivated, staying goal-oriented. And so this is this emotional check-in kind of embodies that how do I stay moving aspect of self-management. If you took the ERQ, that was one of the assessments you got to take as you prepared for week 3. So as you prepared for self-management, one of those assessments was the ERQ. And that one talked a lot or assessed a lot about the concept of reappraisal. So changing the way you think about a situation in order to change how you feel about it. And if you took that brief COPE scale, that would help identify what strategies you naturally use when you're dealing with stress. So those 2 assessments here tie in nicely. If you haven't taken those, you can go back and take those, or you can also think about look up your scores and see how what you did in this emotional check-in aligned with the behaviors that you reported through those assessments. We're going through here these first several weeks, Goleman's 4 domains. That first week, week 2 rather, we looked at self-awareness, which was understanding your own emotions, triggers, and not fun, and emotional tendencies. So that was week 2. Now, one thing I've done that I thought maybe I'll also do the next couple of weeks is try to tie in some of that personality assessment, those assessments we took. Many of you took the DIA character strengths. And I was thinking how it might be helpful to kind of map some of those these emotional intelligence domains as we go through. Now, I want to be very clear that any of your character strengths from that assessment can help you succeed in any of these domains with emotional intelligence. Okay, they're not like they don't operate as silos, but some of these character strengths have kind of a home base, we'll call it, where they naturally support emotional intelligence. So when I say home base in this context, I'm like basically saying, referring to the primary emotional intelligence domain where a particular character strength is maybe naturally expressed or naturally active, where the domain where this character strength has like maybe the strongest or the most obvious application. So again, this doesn't mean a strength is limited to that domain. It doesn't mean other strengths can't be applied to that domain. This is just kind of like when we look at these couple strengths I have in yellow here, it doesn't mean like self-regulation is limited to self-awareness, right? It's just that it's a starting point or a good anchor there. So if you had self-regulation as a top character strength, you'll also see this one in self-management. But this helps individuals notice natural, those internal impulses and develop awareness of their emotional triggers. So because that's what self-regulation does, it naturally promotes self-awareness. If you had perspective, also known as wisdom, this type of talent encourages reflection and insight into one's own mental and emotional states, which again is a great, is part of that self-awareness domain. Honesty. This facilitates self-reflection and acknowledgement of one's true feelings, right? Humility. These people acknowledge their limitations without defensiveness, which enhances self-understanding. If you remember when we talked about both self-awareness and self-management, we saw different ways that people, especially with low self-awareness and low self-management, respond to feedback. Either they dismiss it or they're very critical of it. People with humility acknowledge these limitations and they're not usually defensive to it. And then curiosity obviously promotes openness to internal experiences, so that constant wanting to learn and being curious about self. So if you had one of those in your top character strengths, you've probably had some natural tendencies and natural strengths and self-awareness, some already innate skills that you've acquired over life that make this domain potentially more natural to you. So in week 3, we looked at self-management, which was defined as regulating one's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors effectively in different situations. So the behavioral aspect, right? How are we choosing to express or not express that emotion? Some character strengths that align really well here are self-regulation again. So managing those impulses and emotions effectively. Perseverance. People with perseverance are have very goal-directed behavior despite setbacks. So we talked about goal-directed behavior as a key skill of self-management. Someone with zest is usually full of positive energy and motivation, so it helps them regulate their mood and their drive. To that point, someone with hope is obviously very resilient and usually optimistic and has optimistic coping strategies. So both zest and hope align really well with the conversations we had on optimism and pessimism under self-management. And then someone with prudence, these are people who are very deliberative. They make thoughtful choices under pressure. So obviously, even under emotional pressure, they're going to be the same way. This week, we're on social awareness for week 4. So for you, this week might be week 4, or you're watching this the next week, whatever it was. Week 4 in our syllabus is we are discussing social awareness, and we'll continue this on into week 5. And we're going to define this here in a minute. But if you had these type of character strengths, then you probably have a natural talent set in social awareness. So empathy, understanding others' emotions. We're going to actually spend the rest of this recording on empathy. Social intelligence, obviously, it's like a direct synonym of social awareness. People are good at reading social situations and other people's feelings. Love. These are people who have strong concern and and a desire for emotional connection to others. Obviously, that's going to fit under anything social. Fairness. People with fairness promote awareness of equity and love to consider multiple perspectives, which is the key aspect of social awareness. And then finally, appreciation of beauty and excellence. These people enhance the noticing of emotional richness in others people's expressions. So again, these are kind of some home-based talents for social awareness, but obviously we can plug many others in, all of them in. For example, curiosity. We saw that under self-awareness, but obviously someone with curiosity under social awareness can aim that talent at being curious about other people, right? So don't look at this as limiting your skills. I just wanted to highlight in advance that if you happen to have one of these, some of the ways that we grow in these areas might be more innate to you than to other people. So let's define social awareness. And of course, we're going to just pull directly from our source, Goleman, who basically defines social awareness as the ability to accurately, the word accurately is the key word here, perceive the emotions, needs, and concerns of other people, and to understand social dynamics in a given context. We're really going to be looking at that first part of the definition here today. But to understand social dynamics in a given context, we'll look at that in part 2 during week 5. Now, to accurately perceive the emotions and needs and concerns of other people, this isn't just empathy, but it largely encompasses being empathetic. So understanding other people's feelings and perspectives. There's also understanding group dynamics, emotional currents, and power relationships. Being service-oriented, so recognizing the emotions, but also meeting the needs of others. So it's not just noticing emotions, but being proactive on assisting or being present with them. So we've got a lot to unpack here, but Goleman ultimately emphasizes that social awareness is not just about understanding others emotionally, but doing so in real time, especially in complex or emotionally charged situations. And I have a little activity that you won't really get to participate in, but you'll see the activity we try to do in class that was supposed to kind of simulate charged situations and make you think back on self-awareness, self-management, and social awareness. Nonetheless, it's a skill that enables people to tune into subtle emotional signals and respond appropriately, even when emotions aren't explicitly expressed. Now, why is this a key feature of emotional intelligence? Well, with self-awareness, we define this as noticing what happens inside you, what's happening inside of you. For self-management, we define this as choosing what to do with that internal awareness, with that self-awareness. And then for social awareness, this is noticing and accurately reading what's happening around you, especially in other people. And why is this a key feature? Well, social awareness is a major domain of emotional intelligence. Well, social awareness connects you to others. So, it enables empathy, understanding, and compassion, which are obviously core components to human connection. Builds trust and psychological safety. So people feel seen and heard and valued by you when you accurately tune into them. Obviously, this is going to improve communication, but not just verbal communication. We're talking unspoken cues, so tone of voice, which is spoken, but right. The difference between, I think of that when my husband says, "Are you mad?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not mad." But obviously, my tone is conveying that perhaps I am mad. But these unspoken cues also include body language, right? And just reading the emotional undercurrents, and responding appropriately. Obviously, understanding, having social awareness helps you understand group dynamics and other people's emotional states, which is going to lead to better teamwork, fewer conflicts. And then this also influences your ability to teach, lead, and serve others. So no matter if you're in a leadership position or you're a caregiver or you're in a customer-facing role, this is a foundation. Social awareness is a foundation for influence and support in that. And if you remember last week in social management, self-management, social management would be an interesting domain, but we will make that up right now. Under self-management, we talked about how do we handle and work with people who have low self-management skills, right? And one of the things we know from the research is that if you model healthy self-management, those around you will likely begin modeling some of those things as well. So this is where leadership comes in, your ability to impact others in emotional intelligence. We defined last week with self-management, as well as self-awareness, that it's a skill, not a trait. And it's the same thing with social awareness. Social awareness is a skill, not a trait, not something you're necessarily born with. It's learnable. You can improve your competencies in this area. If you're low empathy, if you're not a good listener, if you're not good at reading nonverbal cues, this can be strengthened through reflection and practice and feedback. And some people may seem more naturally empathetic, right? More emotionally attuned, and those with high empathy, this is home for you, right? But we know that for those who aren't high in that area, that you can develop self-awareness or any of these emotional intelligence domains through practice, through reflection, and through feedback. Now, Goffman has 3 key skills that make up social awareness. Okay, so 3 areas you want to focus on. Today's video, we're just going to focus on empathy because that's all we got through in class. But we'll start with empathy and we're going to finish with empathy today, and then we'll pick up the other 2 next week. But first, I want to distinguish empathy from sympathy, which is a useful starting point. Let me reshare my screen because I also need to enable sound. So I'm going to play this video clip and your audio if you need to.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So if that was part of a lecture from Dr. Brene Brown, and if you're not familiar with her, she is a researcher, author, motivational speaker. She studies human connection. That's really where her passion is. Her works are amazing. So if you haven't heard of Brene Brown, please go check her out. But I love especially what she does here, dissecting the difference between empathy and sympathy, which is super useful for diving into this emotional intelligence domain. So as she said, empathy is feeling with. It's like saying, I get it, I've been there too, or I can imagine how that must feel. In class, we had a great question about how do you empathize with someone when you haven't been through what they've been through? And so a lot of that's that imagination aspect, or really just reaching in and being curious aspect. But you're trying to understand their experience from their point of view and connect with it emotionally. Sympathy, on the other hand, is feeling for someone. So notice the distinctions of the prepositions here. Feeling with someone is empathy, feeling for someone is sympathy. So that's more like saying, sympathy is more like saying, that sounds really hard. Sorry you're going through that. But from a bit of a distance, right? You care, but you're not necessarily stepping into their shoes. You're not climbing down that ladder. So we're going to focus on empathy because that is a huge component of social awareness. And this is sensing others' emotions, understanding their perspective, and taking an active interest in their concerns. So this can be done a number of ways, but we've got to recognize emotional cues, those verbal and nonverbal, being emotionally attuned without being overwhelmed by it. So an aspect I want to address here, if you're high empathy, and I have insight on this just because I'm high empathy, but sometimes investing in someone's emotions, like taking the time to tune into their emotions, means you're actually wearing that emotion, right? If my husband has a bad day, all of a sudden I'll find, wow, I feel like I'm having a bad day. But I've just cued into his emotional state so well that I am not able to remove myself from it and experience my own thing. So connecting with someone, but not being overburdened by it. And then also suspending judgment, as Dr. Brown points out, you need to suspend your own judgment to understand, to be able to understand someone else's inner world. Because I think it's also intuitive to be like, well, yeah, it sucks to be where you're at because you made the choice to do that. You chose to ABC. That's why you have DEF, right? So we have to kind of suspend that to really be an empathetic person. Now, there's two types of empathy that I want to highlight. And you probably are the most familiar with emotional empathy, and cognitive empathy is quite distinct. Now, we'll talk about the assessments you took for this week in a second, but they actually assessed largely these two different types of empathy. So we have emotional empathy, also called affective empathy. And this is feeling what another person feels. So literally sharing that emotional level, right? You're sharing their emotions automatically. For example, you see a friend crying, and so you maybe start crying too, right? You see someone happy, and so then you feel happy too. This is emotional empathy. Cognitive empathy is distinct. And I want to reiterate, I guess I'm jumping to my bottom point, is that both of these are essential for strong emotional intelligence, and both can be developed with practice. Cognitive empathy is understanding what another person feels or thinks without necessarily sharing the emotion. So you recognize your friend is upset because of a loss of some type, but you stay calm and think about how to help. Okay. We'll see cognitive empathy again here later today. So now again, emotional empathy helps you connect and respond with genuine care. Cognitive empathy helps you understand perspectives, right? And regulate your response appropriately. So emotional empathy is great. And if my friend's crying and I'm going to cry with them, that offers them some support. But it's not that cognitive empathy where maybe I know how to then support them through that. What does it necessarily help? It doesn't help all the time if I'm just sitting there crying with them, right? What's the next step? What can I do for them? I think there's something else I wanted to say on this slide. I think I said it this way in class. Emotional empathy helps you connect. Cognitive empathy helps you respond effectively. Emotional empathy helps you connect. Cognitive empathy helps you respond effectively. And that's the distinction. Now, you took 3 assessments to prepare for week 4. The first one was the Toronto Empathy Questionnaire. And this one largely just measured emotional empathy. Right. So you basically were looking specifically like how you're emotionally responded to others' experiences, and not so much the cognitive perspective taking. That's the other 2 tests. It had sample questions like, I often have tender, concerned feelings for people, or it upsets me to see someone being treated disrespectfully. So it was asking you, do you feel emotion when someone else is feeling their emotion, right? Do you take on that for them? Trying to think if I had something else to say on that one. Don't think I did. That's what that one was though. So it's a good leveling assessment or assessment just to get a gauge on your overall emotional empathy. And I'm guessing there's probably a distinct line in this class between those who are like, yes, that emotional empathy, I'm in, or no, that's the part of empathy I really struggle with. So that assessment's good to get a baseline measurement for yourself on that one. Now, if you took the Greater Good Empathy Quiz, that one was a little more informal. It was built on other assessments like the IRI and the TEQ. So it kind of merged all the psychological research into one. And that one looked at not just how you recognize emotions, but how you respond to other emotions. So it was looking at both emotional empathy and cognitive empathy, understanding what others are feeling and sharing in that emotion. So assessing those 2 things. When I see someone being treated unfairly, these are some example questions that I wrote down here. When I see someone being treated unfairly, I get upset. I can tell when a friend is upset. I sometimes struggle to see things from another person's perspective. Helen was reversed for, but that's what that one asked about. So this is also a good assessment for introduction to measuring your baseline for empathy. It's got a real approachable language to it. If you looked at it, looked more like a pop psychology tool, right? So you can use it with different ages. Not sure how young you could go, but it's an easy one to pass on to a variety of audiences because of the language type in it. But again, it looks at both emotional reactions and that perspective taking. So that cognitive and emotional empathy. Now, the interpersonal reactivity index, the IRI, it kind of uses like a multidimensional empathy scale that was developed by Davis in the 80s. So unlike most empathy assessments, the IRI captures also both cognitive and emotional components with 4 distinct subscales. So the subscales included perspective taking, which is a cognitive empathy component, right? So how do you have the ability to adopt others' points of view? Empathetic concern, which was an emotional empathy component. So feelings of warmth, compassion, and concern for others. Personal distress, which again it's an emotional empathy component, but it was kind of more self-oriented. So you get feelings of anxiety and discomfort in response to other people's distress, right? So on the one hand, if you're high empathy, you might take on someone's anxiety because they're feeling anxious. On the other hand, someone who's maybe low emotional empathy gets uncomfortable with someone's other emotional state, right? So that's a distinction there. And then there's this fantasy scale, which is kind of like a cognitive emotional hybrid, but it's like, do you have the tendency to imaginatively identify with fictional characters? So it was kind of measuring perspective, ability to kind of that perspective taking, but a different swing, right? Now, again, these psychometrics, these different assessments were basically a good way to look at a baseline of maybe your emotional intelligence your emotional empathy and your cognitive empathy. So that's how we took this. So you can keep your results in mind as we move through these things. Now, I want to stress that empathy is not just a feeling, it's a brain-based skill, right? We've been highlighting that through this whole course so far, the intense connection between emotional intelligence and the way our brains function, right? I don't want to spend, I guess, too much time on this because I'm not the brain expert, but I know a little bit, I suppose. Basically, at the core, you have these like mirror neurons, and they set fire when we act and when we see someone else act, okay? So they kind of, basically what they do is pertains to empathy or emotional intelligence in general, is they let you emotionally mirror other people. So that's the part of your brain that helps with that aspect of taking on that emotional empathy, right? I'm going to mirror your emotion. There's lots of brain regions that help bring empathy to life. We've got this anterior insula. That's where you feel other people's emotions. This anterior, what's it called? Do I have it on there? The ACC, the cingulate cortex, I believe is what that is, helps you tune into others' emotional pain and regulate your emotional response. There's a part of the prefrontal cortex that helps you take someone else's perspective. So that's the cognitive empathy. And you've got some other areas that basically help you stay grounded in your own identity while connecting with others. I can't remember the name of that. I think the acronym is TPJ, look it up. And that's the something junction. That's what this means. Anyways, it's part of your brain that helps you stay grounded and like your own identity while connecting with others. So that's the part of empathy that, hey, I'm taking on your emotion, but I can walk away from this and not just stay in your emotional state, right? And this is all where attunement comes in. So attunement means being deeply present, really tuning in to someone else's tone of voice, their expression, their posture. It's not just noticing emotion, but it's that resonating with it. So in neuroscience, these mirror neurons help us tune in or sync up with others. And these other parts of the brain, the insula, the ACC, help you feel it. And that prefrontal cortex helps you stay steady and respond with care. Again, all of this can be learned. And that's what we kind of started the premise of the class with, was that your brain can grow and it can change and you can learn these skills, right? So empathy is not just something in your heart. Some of you have values and ethical and moral a foundation that makes empathy like a core tenet of who you are. But the ability to be empathetic is not just heart-based. It's not just in those morals and values and ethics and all those things. It's also in your head. And so with practice, you can grow in this area. A question I was thinking about while I was going through this is, how do we miss, like when it comes to empathy, how do we miss emotional signals from others? So if you remember, the definition of social awareness was also being able to accurately identify and recognize and take on the perspective and understand the perspective of another person's life and emotions, right? But sometimes we're just wrong, right? We're not reading it correctly. Maybe we have low empathy, so we don't even see it. Or we have high empathy, but we're misreading it. So there are basically three things, common reasons why we miss emotional signals. And there's actually, I would say, a fourth one that I don't have here, and that also has to do with like your neurological components. So we'll talk about autism a little, just in the passing on next week, but your brain structure, right, can also prevent you from being able to read signals at all. But let's talk about these three. So the first one is biasness. So a prejudgment that blocks your understanding. You're bringing your own assumptions, your own stereotypes and beliefs to the situation, and that's going to shape how you see someone before you can truly listen to them. So if you're working with a colleague and you tend to see them as dramatic and that they overreact, you're probably going to quickly dismiss their pain, because instead of trying to understand, you've already got this biasness about their behavior, right? So you're seeing them through a filter that you've already set up, and you're not able to see them clearly. So that's kind of an example of this biasness, right? Or perhaps like, well, if you took Clifton Strengths and you had responsibility very high, or even if you didn't, you can go Google Clifton Strengths responsibility. And these are people who are, as the name implies, highly responsible, highly ethical. They're responsible for their own actions. So these type of people also believe other people are responsible for their own actions, right? You make choices and they have consequences. So great gift, love the talent, but perhaps it builds up a biasness of, well, you made those choices, so now you're in this situation. And if that's the filter we have up, then we can miss the empathy, right? It doesn't mean that that filter is incorrect. We just have to look, did I put that filter up first? Is that filter getting in the way of me seeing them clearly? We can find a balance there. The other two, stress. So if you have an emotional overload, then it's going to narrow your focus. When you're stressed, your brain goes into survival mode and you start to focus on your own problems, and it's harder to tune into other problems, right? So it's that idea of you can't pour from an empty pitcher, right? Or empty cup. If you're overwhelmed with deadlines, you might miss that your coworker's having a tough day, right? If you're emotionally maxed out and you're not going to have the capacity to care deeply about someone else in that moment. So it's probably a little obvious. So go back to that self-awareness and self-management stage, right? You have to pour into yourself, into this first domain to be successful here. Distraction, if you're not present, maybe you're on your phone or thinking about your to-do list, or you're just mentally checked out, like you're not going to be able to pick up on emotional cues, like if you're not paying attention, right? So an example might be nodding along when someone talks, but not actually absorbing what they're saying. I'm really good at fake listening. That's something I excel at, but it gets me in trouble when I'm like, oh, they shared something important and I missed it. I had this note here for like a shortened version. Being biased clouds your view. Being stressed drains your capacity, and being distracted pulls your focus. And all three of these are going to get in the way of you truly noticing and responding to how someone feels. Now, what we did in class, and this is, well, just 2 more slides and then we'll go ahead and end this and we'll pick up next week, but we just wanted to talk about practice that perspective taking. And Dr. Brown covered this briefly in her video as one of the key components of empathy is perspective taking. Now, you might be thinking this is we looked at empathy as 2 things, right? Emotional empathy and cognitive empathy. And perspective taking in my mind was emotional empathy, but it's actually a cognitive empathy skill. So that blew my mind, just sharing that. It's a cognitive skill, right? So it's kind of like, it's not necessarily feeling with someone, but getting into them intellectually, right? Getting it, not just feeling what they're feeling, but getting what they're saying at an intellectual level. And that's what kind of makes it that cognitive empathy. And you've heard the term, put yourself in someone else's shoes. That's basically what perspective taking is. So now the activity that we did in class, I'll show you in a second, but I kind of prefaced it with this idea of, I'm going to show basically 3 potentially emotionally triggering scenarios. And I'll just show them to you real quick, right? So basically what I did was I opened up the class into breakout rooms, and you would choose one of these 3 breakout rooms. And if you look at the topics, these can be, depending on where you're at, relatively emotionally charging or triggering topics, right? What I had students do, and you can think about this for yourself, is choose the breakout room where you can be emotionally intelligent, right? What you would do in that breakout room is you needed to practice taking on the perspective of the opinion that actually wasn't the one you held. And that can be really hard depending on what topic you chose, right? So I had these kind of like a gradient from easier, yellow to maybe harder in the red. And I had encouraged you to pick the one where you could remain emotionally intelligent, right? Where it wouldn't charge you too much. And the exercise, I think by and large went really well, because we did this you got to choose your perspective, right? Or you got to choose your topic. But also, if you're learning that self-awareness, when you did this activity, you would need it, and when this happens in real life, right? Because these are actually conversations that happen at the university level quite frequently, especially for me in literature and languages. I feel like we're talking about some element of this weekly, right? I just want to digress from that, but I feel like I hear conversations of this nature in the real world all the time. And to be successful in them, you have to not just have social awareness that this obviously perspective taking activity shows that idea of intellectually relating to someone at that cognitive empathy, right? You're not taking on their feelings or their passion. And it doesn't mean that you agree with them. You're not giving up your opinion or changing your mind when you take perspective taking. You're just saying, okay, I see where you're coming from. That's it. That's what perspective taking is. That's what cognitive empathy is. And but you have to be socially aware. You have to be self-aware and have good self-management to survive in some of these conversations, right? So perspective taking helps you understand people better. It doesn't mean that you become them. That's a big difference. But this is a core function of cognitive empathy. It requires imagining and understanding someone else's viewpoint or emotional state, especially people from different contexts and cultural backgrounds. This also is going to play into that organizational awareness, which we'll pick up in week 5. But, inside the class, everyone reported, having relatively general ease, having these conversations and taking on the different perspective and doing so in a very professional way. And I think that's great. And what I hope is that if you could have the perspective of, let's say you were in class that day and did the breakout rooms, that you would have had the same success. But also, I want you to think about when conversations like this play out in the real world, can you still have the same emotionally intelligent foundation that you could muster up in class, in the classroom setting, right? Because the other thing you have to think about is you are going to leave this class able to engage in a variety of topics and conversations from a very emotionally intelligent, grounded level, because you are now self-aware and self-managed and socially aware. But you won't be having these conversations necessarily with people who also share in that emotional intelligence. And that's going to constantly push back on your need to constantly check in on that self-awareness and that self-management and that social awareness in real time, as Goldman was talking about. Social awareness is effectively and accurately reading the emotional cues of others in real time, especially in charged and emotional situations. And that's kind of where we started. So after we did this activity in class, I had those quick calm down tools available in case anybody needed them. But everyone seemed to have a really good time. That went really well. So again, empathy, we defined it as sensing the emotions of others and understanding their perspective, taking an active interest in their concerns. Next week, we'll pick up with the other two skills and some other things, organizational awareness and service orientation. And that's basically where we're gonna go from there. So, all right, I'll see you guys in week 5.